Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Grunfeld, and as chairman of the Speakers Program, I would like to welcome you to this, our first event of what promises to be a very successful winter quarter. Confronted with the reality of 4 more years of a President Nixon, I believe we should reflect upon certain crucial issues of the day. The first being that of a cruel and criminal war which daily takes its toll of innocent lives. The second, the tremendous erosion of civil liberties which have occurred these last 4 years and prior to that as well. We have with us today 2 men who have witnessed firsthand this violation of one of our amendments. Joseph Benti, former ABC newsman and currently teaching at UCLA, and William Farr, a Times reporter who spent 46 days in jail for refusing to reveal his sources for a story in the Manson trial. Without further ado, I'll turn the program over to Joseph Benti, who will introduce Bill Farr, a personal friend of his. Mr. Benti.
Thank you very much, Steve. Bill and I, Jeff, I was thinking when you said personal friend, Bill Farr and I met as a result of our professional interest. I was asked one day to appear at the Ambassador Hotel as part of a fundraising effort to get Farr out. The fundraising effort was not too successful. Not very many people showed up, but those who did were very enthusiastic, and I met what I then considered a man who was very mild-mannered and hardly the type of person I thought who would become the focal point of a battle over whether or not we, the press, and in reality the representatives of the public, were going to have the rights guaranteed us under the First Amendment, and in addition to that, privileges for which precedent had been set and established and accepted for quite some time in our country's history and in the history of the state of California. Bill is a very mild man, mild-mannered, as they say of Clark Kent, and when he strips off his shirt down at the county jail, you find out indeed they do have a Superman, because he is a man committed to his conscience and his principles, and that is rare indeed. I met him again at a symposium or a panel discussion at a meeting in Beverly Hills of the American Civil Liberties Union Fat Cats, who weren't being charged for the panel show, but were being shown what it is the ACLU's money is being spent for, to work for people like Bill Farr and others in our society who need help when they come up against the crunch of the establishment, as Bill has in his way. And in both cases, I was impressed by Bill, and he's, as I said, a shy guy, so all of this is very embarrassing to him. He has points to make which I think have been greatly distorted, not only in print, where I think less distortion has occurred, but on television and radio, where we tend to oversimplify. I admit in my 18 years of broadcasting that I am guilty of oversimplification, and I don't know if I can change, but at least I'm aware of it and I try. Bill has a story that involves all of us because, as Senator Cranston has said, the bill to get the press its privileges, in this case the right to not reveal sources, is not a privilege for the press, but in reality is a protection for the public. It is your right to know that's involved here. And whether or not Bill Farr has a privilege, or Joseph Benti, who seldom if ever had reason to use the privilege, which is why I admire people who do, like Bill Farr, the question really is whether or not you will get what is guaranteed to you under the First Amendment of the Constitution, and that is a free press, and what is implicit in a free press is the right to know all of the information, all of the business, not only of your government, but whatever it is the press looks into on your behalf. And Bill, in addition to his own case, which is one that requires the help of many, many people because the cost of defending himself, he's not wealthy, he has no private source of income, is astronomical. He needs financial help, not for himself, but to pay the legal costs. All of that has to come from those of us who are sitting in this audience and those who are reached by this message. That's one part of his problem, but the other part is where I think he has selflessly dedicated himself to trying to bring to all of us the message that I have just briefly skimmed over, and one which at the beginning I thought, how in the hell can that be involved in the Manson case? And nobody can better explain that than Bill Farr, and also, I think, explain some of the peculiar workings of our society, especially our legal profession, and perhaps clear up some of what has by now become not only confusion, but mystification for most of us as to how he ever got into this and what it is that drives him to continue his fight for the principles that I think brought him to jail and may actually ultimately keep him in jail or send him back to jail again. Bill Farr.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. I'm going to try to briefly recap my dilemma and then put in a pitch where we really need help in regard to legislation that's now before Congress. And then I'm going to try to keep it relatively brief and then open it to questions that Joe and I can answer. Coming on campus, I'm always a little embarrassed to admit that I've been described in the press as a law and order Republican, whatever that means. I'm embarrassed not only because that's generally not very popular on campuses, but while in jail I saw an administration that was already of a questionable status in regard to their arrogance become certainly ever more arrogant, and certainly the bombing situation bears very much on this problem of freedom of the press, because it's not the freedom of the press we're really talking about per se, other than its role to serve the public. And we now have an administration that seems to feel not only that they can bomb a nation into oblivion, but then they have absolutely no obligation to tell either Congress or those of us in the public via the press. I think that's part of a very unfortunate national trend that also manifests itself now in an attitude on the part of the judiciary to show very little reticence to throw reporters in jail. I think the national trend really is separate from my case, but the mentality behind it is one and the same. And I think that both students, the so-called silent majority, and everyone else is becoming much more aware of the danger of this sort of repressive attitude. And I say that not as a radical, but certainly, as I say, I'm not certain I know what the word law and order, or the phrase law and order Republican, but I am a Republican. I might add, my attorney, who has not charged me any money, has decided that his fee is going to be that I re-register as a Democrat, or at least as an independent. And I will say, by the way, that not only am I here to talk to you today thanks to one of the very finest justices of all time, but certainly one of the fine judicial liberals of all time. And it's been sort of an irony for me that in my legal battle, almost all of the help that I've gotten, moral, financial, and in legal ways, has come from the liberal side of the spectrum. I no longer, by the way, am in dire straits financially as a result of the not so successful benefit that Joe mentioned, which was successful enough to make $1,500 over a lot of overhead. It was just put on by friends in a 3-week basis. They wanted to have it before I got into jail, and as it turned out, the Supreme Court ruled against me the very next day, so it was good timing. But 20th Century Fox subsequently allowed the West Coast premiere of The Effect of Gamma Rays and Man in the Moon Marigolds, the proceeds from that to be channeled to my defense fund, and so that the $5,500 to $6,000 that I had put out of my own pocket was reimbursed, or I'd actually put out about $3,000 and then I owed another $3,000. I'm just about even. On Christmas Day, the Times decided to give me a true and fine Christmas present. They said that despite the fact that I had written the story not for them, but for the competitor, although it's not much competition these days, that they were going to assume all my future financial obligations in regard to the legal battle, and that's like giving me $15,000 all at once, and I'm deeply grateful to them. And it would be very difficult for me to express how deeply grateful I am to members of the public and friends and other reporters who helped with those benefits. Joe and John Schubeck came down to participate, and I appreciated both the moral and the financial support, but mainly that problem is behind me, although I would like to speak to you of a serious problem, one of those things about the system that isn't too keen. Among the expenses that I had, and the attorneys, thank goodness in my case, donated their services. Otherwise, instead of talking about $6,000, we'd be talking about $40,000, because Grant Cooper and Mark Hurwitz here in California donated their services, as did F. Lee Bailey. None of them come very inexpensive. But I didn't have that cost, but I had to assume costs of printing of briefs and so forth. And in the U.S. Supreme Court alone, the printing of 40 copies of my brief cost me $3,670. There's something very wrong with the system, particularly now in this day and age when you have Xerox and those type of reproduction processes, that you absolutely have to print your brief. Now, it's an archaic rule, but like many things in the system of justice, as the youth of America are painfully aware, to change them is done very slowly, if at all. But when and if I get out of this current battle, I'm going to lead a battle to change some of the rules. It is true that if I had been an indigent with no money, that I could have filed a pauper's oath. Or, of course, if I had a lot of money, then I wouldn't have to worry, because then I'd have the money to spend, and I could always use it as a tax loophole, too. But like the system of medical care in this country, the people in the middle, between the very poor and the very rich, are in sad shape. And it's a system, you see, in my case, in the end, I wasn't as bad off as Juan Diaz or Joe Blow would be, because I had the news media on my side and it became a cause célèbre and so forth. But like many of you, I guess sometimes it takes your own ox to be gored. I see these weaknesses in the system, not merely in something such as the printing of briefs, but in the formalism of the system. I have been pained by rulings against me, not because the justices really felt that Judge Older was right and I was wrong, or that because they were concerned with justice, but because there were certain precedents, they ruled in a given way. One needs to take a good hard look at that system also. Luckily now, after I've gone to jail, in the end you have these last resort actions called habeas corpus proceedings, which in a literal way mean for the authorities to serve up your body if they can't justify holding you. But the good thing about habeas corpus proceedings is that they can, if they will, the appellate courts and the Supreme Court can pattern their rulings to justice, not being bound necessarily by prior rulings. And I'm, for very selfish reasons, hopeful that that will be done in my case, because even though I served 46 days and I was released by Douglas, the battle is certainly not over, and my chances are not even 50-50 of staying out of jail. And if I go back this next time, given the mentality of this judge and the deputy county counsel representing him, they have made it clear that I will be in jail years. And I find that very frightening. And it's one of the reasons I'm here. It's not just me, but there's something very medieval about a rule of law that says because a man won't comply with a court order, that he can be sent to jail forever and a day, threatened with the rest of his life in jail. And I don't mean to over-dramatize it, because I really don't think they're going to be able to hold me for the rest of my life, but I don't know. But I do know that they probably could get away with several years before somebody would find a method under cruel and unusual punishment to release me. The question is, 46 days, frankly, wasn't all that bad in jail. I was treated better, I think, than if any of you were involved in a campus situation where you got picked up, you would be treated much worse than I was. At the same time, you'd have somebody to talk to. I didn't have. I was segregated. I don't know which side, whether I was going to contaminate the criminals or vice versa, but they kept me separate. I had enough visits from friends so that it wasn't really, the term solitary confinement conjures up something a little worse than what I suffered from. But let's say if I were there 3 years, the number of visitors I would get, even among friends, there would be a natural attrition, so that you'd have maybe 1 or 2 visitors. You'd have these 10-hour stretches of being literally all by yourself, where I couldn't even go out to eat with other inmates. They brought the food to me. They would bring the library cart to me, not let me go to the jail library. I find some of this ridiculous. I never saw the sunlight or saw any fresh air or the unfresh air we have here in Los Angeles during those 46 days. But you see, the 46 days wasn't bad. It really wasn't. What was hard on me, frankly, was that I had no way of knowing whether we were talking about 46 days, 46 months, or maybe 46 years. And when the time comes, with some of the same zeal that I saw, unfortunately, it went to waste, and I would be ready to concede that for the support of McGovern, some of the same zeal that has gone into the anti-war effort, I would like to see focused on two types of legislation. One that deals with the problem of which I was just speaking. The civil contempt law in this state must be changed. I think a judge has the right in civil cases to have some power to force you to comply. For instance, if any of us were in business together and we had 12 vehicles, for instance, and the judge said, well, Mr. Farr, out of equity, you should get 4 and your partner should get 8. And I said, well, those partners screwed me. I'm not going to give them those 8 automobiles. I think a judge probably ought to be able to put you in jail until you turn them over. But should he be able to put you in jail for something like that, or for just not answering a question forever? I think there's got to be some definite limitation, and I think that limitation reasonably might be 6 months. That's pretty coercive. None of us would want to spend 6 months, even at your age. When you get as ancient as I am, maybe 6 months seems like a good portion of the good years you've got left. But the reason it would be a reasonable amount of time is that in criminal law, you have the right to a jury trial if the potential penalty is at least 6 months. And I feel very confident in my case I never would have been convicted by a jury, and in fact I think in this instance I wouldn't have been convicted by another judge. I was tried by another judge on the charge that I aided and abetted and solicited persons to violate a known court order, and I was found not guilty. Certainly no other judge I can think of in the system here would send me to jail ad infinitum. But you see, the time will come, and we're in bad times. I don't think I have to outline that to you people, that there will be somebody without the clout that I have with the news media who will go to jail. And you may never even hear of them, because sometimes the news media overlooks cases of some importance. And what you need to do is remove that power from any single judge. I've seen some very good men, once they put on those black robes, who feel that they have penultimate power, and it does something. I think that my experience in my own case pretty well has proven to me that Lord Acton's axiom that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is true. I think it's a human failing among good men, and certainly it's a greater danger among bad men. And I think that legislation could be proposed and would get a much more friendly reception in the state legislature just because of what happened to me. Now, the other legislation that I'd like you to give some study to is legislation currently before the Congress proposed by Senator Alan Cranston and a California congressman named Jerome Waldy, which would give reporters an absolute protection without exceptions to protect their sources. Now, it has been variously termed a newsman's privilege bill and a shield law. The first thing the news media has to do, and Joe touched on this, is to convince you people and the public in general that we do not want any special privilege for reporters, per se. We don't want this special status unto ourselves for any other reason than except that we represent the public as a surrogate. Not all of you can come down, and even if you had the time and the inclination to come down, you couldn't get into the Manson trial or other trials because of limited seating. So we're there to represent you, to tell you what's going on, and to let you know if the prosecution is, and it's not as simple as judges would tell you that it's just a matter of defendants' rights versus fair trial. What about if you have a vicious judge in collusion with a vicious prosecutor and they're screwing some defendant? If we're there, that defendant's chance for fair trial is greater because we are there. Always this question seems to be posed as if the press always was totally disregarding of a defendant's right to a fair trial. In the last 10 years, I have not seen that. And so, and you will be confronted, if you study the situation, with legislation that has certain exceptions. Now, I'm urging you to support those without any exceptions. Some of them even seem reasonable, but they have phrases like, the exceptions are when there's probable cause to believe that this evidence is needed to prosecute a crime. The term probable cause is one that bothers me. Another one is a compelling and overriding national interest. I don't know what that means, and I certainly would not want the Nixon administration or Judge Older to determine for me what's a compelling and overriding interest about anything. And I think that's the danger. I mean, regardless of what your political or philosophical persuasion is, when you write in exceptions and when you erode freedom of the press or any other constitutional freedom, you just do away with it. That isn't to say that the press should have some untrammeled license to do whatever they want to do, particularly when it comes to criminal trials, because you have the Sixth Amendment to be worried about also. But it's better to have voluntary guidelines, because if you start impinging on the First Amendment, you will find, and I think you may find this in the very best of times, but certainly now where we have a repressive attitude, a judge can determine certain phrases any way he wants to, and so that you write exceptions and you're subject to the whim and caprice of a judge. And I know that better than most, not merely because I went to jail, but let me give you a very brief capsule summary of my case. Sometime in July of 1970, I learned that there had been supposedly a murder master plan by the Manson family to kill other celebrities other than the ones that had been killed, Sharon Tate and the others. Specifically, according to Susan Atkins, in a conversation with her cellmate. Susan Atkins was a co-defendant of Manson. And the Manson family had plans to kill Liz Taylor, Richard Burton, Frank Sinatra, and Tom Jones and Steve McQueen, and do it in various gruesome fashion. The Manson family apparently didn't like Frank, and they decided that they not only should kill him, but they should use his skin and sell it in his hippie shops as lampshades. And there were all sorts of gruesome details of that nature. Susan Atkins had some real compunction about killing Tom Jones because she was very, very attracted to Tom, and she thought it would be kind of a good waste of manhood to bump him off. But that was the essence of the story. I had talked to the cellmate of Susan Atkins, and we had done an independent investigation and determined, at least that the family had talked about it. I'm still not even convinced they really had this master plan. Then the prosecution took a statement from Virginia Graham, who was the cellmate. And because I wanted to use that statement for verification and also to protect a source, and even today, since I still have a legal battle involved, I can't go into the other source, but I had a primary source long before the attorneys in the case were involved. But I did obtain the statement that dealt with these celebrity murders, and I did the story. Now, on the afternoon before I did the story, the judge called me into chambers. He had learned I had the statement. We had a nice, friendly discussion, and during that discussion, he said that he wasn't happy about my doing the story. He wanted me to tell him who the sources were, where I got the statements. I invoked Section 1070, which is the State Evidence Code section that protects reporters in their right to not reveal sources. And the judge said, well, I grant that that's the way the law is. I can't force you to tell me. And then went on to say, and I will think nonetheless, this is an exact quote, I will think nonetheless of you or the Herald Examiner for not complying with my demand. Bang, that's the end of it. The story's printed the next day. As a precaution, by the way, so as to not violate the defendant's rights, the night before the story was published, I called the judge at home and suggested that he block out the windows on the bus because the jury was sequestered. That's the reason I had no compunction about doing the story, by the way, in the middle of the trial, because I felt with a sequestered jury that the story would never get to them. But I was concerned that going to and from the Ambassador Hotel, they might see the headlines, because you may recall that President Nixon, himself a lawyer, certainly if there was ever going to be a prejudicial statement, he he made a comment about Manson's guilt right in the middle of the trial, and it was a banner headline in all newspapers, and some of the jurors did see it going to and from the hotel. So to preclude that from happening, I suggested that they black out the windows on the bus. They, in fact, whited them out with borax, and so the jury never saw the story. And I want people to remember that, because I think I would grant myself that it would have been irresponsible in the extreme to do that story in the middle of the trial if the jury, in fact, would see it. All right. That's the end of the matter. The story appears, and there's a little furor that day, and that's that. No proceedings against me. The day before, the judge conceded to me face-to-face, and on the record, it's in the transcript, that I had the right not to reveal my sources. So, 7 months later, after I had become a fuzz-flack, or in fact an executive assistant and press secretary to the district attorney, the judge learns about this and says, hey, you're no longer a reporter. You can't refuse to answer those same questions I asked you 7 months ago. And that's how they convicted me. And that's what I'm talking about when you have a law, and in that instance, the law didn't say anything about former reporters. I think it's manifestly ridiculous to everybody in this room that if I give you a promise today not to reveal your name if you help me with a story, that promise probably should exist in perpetuity. By the way, the state legislature now has cleared up the law so that I could never be convicted in that way. But I'm in an 8-month limbo where it doesn't help me at all. And once again, another judge, or a justice in this case, dodged the issue as to whether my privilege to protect sources had evaporated with my change of jobs. And they said, well, we won't rule on that. And the reason they didn't rule on it is that they know that it's totally unpalatable to any right-thinking person that I should be convicted in that way. So what they said really was that the state legislature had no right to pass this Section 1070 because it was an unconstitutional interference with separation of the powers, which in lay terms was saying the state legislature has no right to keep a judge from controlling his own proceedings. To me, that's of itself a little ridiculous. It's like saying that the state legislature can't pass the evidence code in which you conduct trials. And once again, you may, all of you probably are familiar with the phrase one man, one vote, which the good Supreme Court has said is the law of the land, except when it comes to electing judges and justices. It escapes me why they think they can be excluded from this triad of executive, judiciary, and legislative check and balance, but they do feel that way. And not all judges, not all justices, but you have to protect against the capricious ones. And that's why you don't want exceptions in these laws. You need an absolute privilege so that they can't sink you with the loopholes, because they will strangle you with them if they can in time. At any rate, the District Court of Appeal upheld Judge Older, and they wrote this rule about unconstitutional interference. I didn't get a hearing in the state Supreme Court, and I didn't get a hearing in the U.S. Supreme Court, and then I was ordered to jail. And I only got out thanks to Douglas, and I could be going back. But I think what is, there's for me, a bit of an embarrassment in regard to my case, because I would be the first one to grant that there's no vast public good involved in the story I did. I have no apologies for it. There are a lot of people who feel, well, I took some terrible chance with defendants' rights. I don't see it that way, although that's not a bad argument. The fact that the jury was sequestered made all the difference in the world to me. But what I would grant is that there was no vast public good involved in my story. But the issue and the principle transcends my given case. Also, I would want to point out very forcefully that I don't care whether, I never intended to be a martyr, and the judge certainly could have kept me from being that any time. He could have let me out in 5 minutes. It would have kept me from being any kind of a martyr. I never meant to be a symbol of freedom of the press, really, because I think there's a certain lack of purity of position, and this story wasn't that big a deal. The public would not have been harmed at all if they never read my story. But the principle remains the same, plus the fact that I gave somebody my personal and professional promise, and it stuns me that the judge and the justices involved in my case can't comprehend that no matter what the story was, that as a matter of principle, I feel I can't break those promises. And It has been pointed out to me that the attorneys involved with me perjured themselves. They lied and said on the stand and said, wouldn't cop out and say that they were the ones. And so even some of my own attorneys and a portion of the hierarchy at the LA Times have said, listen, these guys forfeited their right to your protection when they leave you out in the cold and then they lie on the stand. My answer to that quite simply is that I'm going to be bound by my ethics and not theirs. And the County Bar Association has put great pressure on me as if to say their position really is that somehow attorneys are better than the rest of us and that they have this higher calling and shouldn't lie under oath. Well, nobody should lie under oath, but I won't grant to attorneys any superior ilk of human being status. It just isn't so. I think that I spend too much time watching them in court, and I know better, for one thing. But it's a very simple thing that I'm going to be bound by my conscience and my ethics and not somebody else's. And certainly I'm willing to pay the price. I have already paid the price. But the only regret I have about that, by the way, is that I made the tactical error of narrowing it down to 6 attorneys of record. It was a very dumb thing for me. It was done really not by me, but by my attorney, and I didn't stop it when I should have. So that I really have a problem that there are 4 attorneys who are innocent. And it would be, I wish there were some way I could clear their names. The truth of the matter is, however, 6 months from now, if I never tell who was involved plus who wasn't involved, 6 months from now, we could ask every one of you in this room who the 6 attorneys were, and there wouldn't be more than 2 of you who could name all 6, and probably 10 of you who could name more than 2. However, if I were to name who the 2 were that gave me the statement, the whole community would remember them for a long time, and they would no longer be attorneys. They would be prosecuted probably for perjury and contempt, although there would be some real problems about, in an evidentiary way, as to trying them. But they would be ruined, to all the legalistics aside. They'd be ruined, they'd be humiliated. And I just am not going to do that to them after I gave them my promise. And the reason the issue transcends just me is that I feel, at least, even though no great public good is involved in this story, if any reporter, myself or anybody, starts blowing the whistle on their sources, the next time a reporter wants to get information about a story where great public good is involved, such as corruption in high or low places, wrongdoing in government, waste of taxpayers' money, the tremendous injustices to small individuals when put up against the power structure in society, then somebody isn't going to take a chance. They're not going to take a chance if they're government employees of losing their jobs, or maybe any kind of employee. If organized crime is involved, for instance, with the terrorism of the mafia, they're worried about something even more important than their jobs. They're worried about their life and limb. These are the reasons why no reporter ever should break his word and reveal a source. And you can't surrender the principle in a situation where the story is of little consequence. I openly grant it's of little great import. But I could no more break my promise in this instance than if it were a Pulitzer Prize winning story. But the damage that would redound to the detriment of all of you and all the public would be great, I think, if reporters if I started the trend and somebody else did it next time around, we would not get information that we need to get, not because we want to sell more newspapers or because we want to see Joe Benti with more time on the air. That isn't the purpose at all. We're going to have exactly the same amount of time where Joe currently doesn't even have. The Times is going to publish the same number of editions, but it's you that we're serving. And that's what's at stake. And I feel that way strongly enough to go to jail, and I'm willing to go back, although every once in a while when I hear the Deputy County Counsel talk about the number of years he feels I ought to stay in there, or how long he conjectures as to how long it would take before I'd change my mind, I think sometimes that they might have to come find me next time. But I think, plain and simple, that's my story, and if there are any questions on the topic, I'd be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Can I... May I add? May I add something? When Bill and I last appeared on a platform together, we were with Senator Cranston, the author of the Senate version of the privilege bill, and we asked what the audience could do, and he said, you don't have to write to Senator Cranston, and you don't have to write to Senator Tunney. You have to write to Senator Sam Ervin, who is a Southerner, but considered by, that's a very prejudicial thing I said there, but I said it only because so very often we stereotype the Southern senator. Sam Ervin is considered the expert in the Senate on the United States Constitution. He has proposed a counter bill to Senator Cranston's. He is the chairman of the committee that will hear this matter and then send it on to the Senate. And his bill is the one that has stipulations in it and that tends to dilute absolute privilege. And Senator Cranston said it would be much more effective to write to him or again to another Southern senator, Senator James Eastland of Mississippi. So if you want to do something in a letter-writing way or petition way, I suggest that you ignore Senators Cranston and Tunney because they have already committed themselves and there's no problem there. You write to the two senators I've mentioned, and more than that, if you're from a community other than Los Angeles, and even including Los Angeles, I'm thinking of the two major newspapers, I would suggest if you read any newspapers, whether they're neighborhood shoppers or whatever, that you contact the editor, publisher best, and ask him if he, as a representative within any of the professional organizations, has made his position known as to how that organization feels about this matter. Because as Senator Cranston said, he was amazed that some of the professional organizations, particularly from the print media, were willing to cave in on some of these issues and allow a privilege measure that had limitations to it. So pressure from you directly to the media, and I suppose radio and television shouldn't be excluded either. If you are the telephone calling, letter writing type, you could perhaps accomplish something for all of us by contacting the media. We asked Bill to take it easy at the top because I know that he's been running like hell, and after you begin talking about one issue for so long, you hear yourself, everything echoes, you've said it so many times. The same problem I have talking about that stuff over at Fishbeck Center. So I thought it would be more productive if Bill had a chance to just briefly tell you why he got where he was and where he hopes to be going, other than jail, that he then open it up for questions and answers. So I think that might be the next phase here. Those of you who are interested in any questions, we'll try to provide the answers. Pardon me? We have two roving microphones on either side here, so.
You said that you said that.
You sound like Dr. George Fishbeck.
Okay. You said that.
What guarantee does the public have that an absolute shield law won't be abused by the press and, in fact, come in conflict with a man's right to a free and fair trial?
You have no absolute protection, but then you have no absolute protection in life about anything. I think it's a matter of balancing all factors, and historically you can show the benefit of a free press that is untrammeled by all sorts of legal restrictions. It's a tough question to answer because I would be the first to admit that I personally know of abuses in the coverage of trials, but most of those abuses, frankly, are 15 years old. There is the trend in regard to trial coverage to have reporters who, in fact, know more about the law, have some experience in covering trials, and are very restrained. And almost every reporter I know is vitally concerned about the Sixth Amendment also, along with the First Amendment. I would make, by the way, unfortunately, and exclude many TV reporters who show up, they've got 3 other assignments that day, and they will come and slam a mic in front of a defendant or attorney asking them when they stop beating their wives or something like that. So there isn't a real protection, but based on the track record of the press, I really feel that you have a situation where historically you can show many instances where a government, for instance, and judges have muzzled the press. I've never heard of the press muzzling the government. And I would opt for a free press because there's a certain diversity. But that's not to say, and I would admit that on occasion you may have a problem of a collision of First and Sixth Amendment rights. But on balance, I still feel that unlimited freedom of the press is best in the public interest. Joe, do you have anything to add?
No, I also agree with the comment you made about radio and television, primarily television. We tend to be very superficial in our coverage of the courts, which is why I very often am not upset at gag rules when it's, if there were some way to apply it to radio and television, because too often we're too cavalier, too superficial. And I don't know how that's going to be solved in commercial television, because we simply don't know how to do it any other way and make money. And that seems to be the motive force behind, that's obviously the motive force behind radio and television. And even though the individual journalists and editors and writers would like it to be otherwise, there doesn't seem to be any indication it's going to be otherwise. So that's just the working situation. But I tend to take the general principle that there should be no limitation on a free press, because as I have said and as Bill has said, it is not the press that you're talking about, it is you. The Pentagon Papers is perhaps the best example of a massive national story involving the public interest, which had to be published before you could know about it. It took the courage of an Ellsberg and a Russo and the others to bring it out, but if they had no place to put it, if they had no way to publish it to get it before you, vital information, which I believe is in the national interest, that is the preservation of our society and some responsibility as citizens for what our leadership does. Without a free press, you would have not got that information, and even that there are attempts to limit that.
There is a good example. For instance, if you were to put the exclusion of national interest in the bill, the New York Times could be prosecuted for violating the national interest. Certainly the administration, this one and the Johnson administration and the Kennedy administration even, would argue that there was all sorts of national security involved in the release of the Pentagon Papers. No one in his right mind who reads them can feel that way, but you can be assured the prosecution is asserting that. Whereas, and it still troubles me, for instance, we have freedom of the press to the extent that the New York Times won the Pulitzer Prize for the publication of the Pentagon Papers, and my good friend Dan Ellsberg is now going on trial this very week and could spend 20 years in prison for having given it to the to the New York Times. And you see, if you really were to put an exclusion in that had to do with national security, maybe Neil Sheehan and the editors at the New York Times would be on trial with him, which is a travesty enough. But the real travesty would be that maybe, because they wouldn't want to go on trial, that if you hadn't that exclusion, maybe the Pentagon Papers would have never gotten to the public. And that's what we're really talking about, these things that would in fact prevent publication, or at least cause a great timidity. I'd like to think, for instance, that the New York Times would go ahead and publish them even if they had to go to jail. But who wants to have to worry about going to jail just to do your job to inform the public? That's what's really wrong. And I know whereof I speak. It's not an abstract concept with me. I sat down there for 46 days not knowing whether I was going to get out shortly or not, and not, as I sit here, not knowing whether I'm going back. And I feel doing my job. And the next time around, if there were a story of great importance, I really might not have the courage to take that kind of chunk out of my life. I'd like to think that I would, but I really don't know. And you just don't want to. You don't want laws in existence that can intimidate the free flow of information, not to the press but to the public.
Oh, she's got a microphone.
Mr. Benti?
Yes.
I'm wondering, what is the best way for the public to try to improve the quality of TV news programming? I mean, is it just to watch the better shows, or right into the shows themselves or to the stations, or how do you try to improve the quality?
Well, the only thing that commercial radio, commercial broadcasting, television included, understands is whether or not you're listening. And if you're not listening or watching, that means they've got to do something with their product. The eyewitness news format is extremely successful. It has become the #1 broadcast in New York City, which is the major market in the country. As somebody pointed out, Dick Adler of TV Guide, one rating point in Los Angeles is worth $300,000 a year in billing. You're talking about a multi-million-dollar market when you talk about Los Angeles. So that a format or a personality or a particular style or approach, whatever it may be, that brings rating points up, increases the take. And that's the operative situation. There's no getting around it. So if you think that a newscast is superficial, you turn it off. You don't watch it. And you write letters, make phone calls. There is no other way that broadcasting will be responsive. There just is no other way, short of setting up an alternative system. I understand that community-supported television, CSTV, which will get channel 63 or 68, is going to try to be on the air in September. But knowing what I know as one who has worked in broadcasting and as a viewer myself occasionally, most of us don't turn to UHF. They certainly make it hard for alternative broadcasting, because the low-band channels, 1 or 2 through 13, have all gone to the commercial guys, and the non-commercial people have to get way up there where few of us ever turn. It's been made difficult, and there is no... Everything is a progression. It's a pyramid. As you increase the amount of viewers, you increase the amount of dollars available to spend in advertising and promotion, so that you can send unwitting, foolish newsmen like myself out to somebody's home and then get a great deal of commercial mileage out of it because you were able to promote it and have everybody talking about it. I apologize for embarrassing you with the reference to Dr. Fishbeck when you were trying to think of your question. I'm sorry, but the fact that everybody knows who Dr. Fishbeck is really a testament to the impact of eyewitness news as opposed to the competition. The only way to stop it is not to watch it. In addition to that, all of the old pressures you've heard about. By now, it's become such a cliche that people are sick and tired of hearing people like us suggest that you write to somebody or telephone somebody, but it is the only way. And don't buy products. The boycott, I still think, is the most successful form of changing anything in this country, because that's where people listen when their products aren't selling. And if it's through advertising on a particular station or for a particular program, that's one way to stop it. But it takes that terribly boring, frustrating business of organization if you want to really make it effective on a massive scale.
Well, in time, too, you see, I think your generation is much more concerned. Maybe if you turn them off enough, it'll change a little bit. Then the generation that follows, you may have the same inclination. In time, it may get better. The problem is I'm not certain that I'm going to live long enough to see it improved.
Or that the system of free exchange of ideas and information may exist by that time. Yes?
Can Reagan pardon you? Does his powers of pardon go into contempt laws?
Well, it does, all right, if it's criminal contempt. Well, there's a strange situation here. I'd be a little bit better off if I had leaped over the council table and tried to strangle a judge, because then I would have been convicted of criminal contempt, and I could have gotten the governor's pardon. And in fact, he would have, for reasons that aren't totally clear to me, because he hasn't always been friendly with the press, but he really would grant a pardon. But because I've been convicted of civil contempt, he has no right to do so. We are going to still be in a legal argument with the governor's office and the courts as to whether, in fact, my case is really civil contempt. The punishment goes to criminal nature, and the judge punish Mr. Farr, and this is a remedial matter, that he has a key to his own cell. He can get out any time he wants to. All he's got to do is tell me what. I may have done that, yes.
There are a great many blacks as well as other people who are in our penitentiary today with undetermined sentences. I just would like to know, do you feel that this is what they call unjust
Cruel and
Cruel and unusual.
punishment.
Well, yeah, what he's pointing out that there are many people in jail, blacks and other groups, and also a lot of whites in jail under the California system under so-called indeterminate sentence. It's not quite the same because it's not really indeterminate. There's an outside limit in their case, as opposed to mine where there's no outside limit. That's not to say that the indeterminate system in California hasn't worked a great injustice, because what it really, in principle, it was supposed to be a system where geared to rehabilitating the prisoners. It hasn't worked out that way. It's worked out as a coercion so that you have to be on the good side of guards, parole people, and so forth, and it ends up, I think, more of a coercion to minority groups than anybody else. And certainly I'm concerned about that. I have thought, and when I was in jail, that to the extent that I could, when and if I ever get out of my own dilemma, that I would like to take part in groups involved in penal reform, prison reform. The problem is with reporters generally is that they think they're instant experts in everything. For instance, I can't come out and even write a legitimate article about conditions in the county jail. What do I know about them, really? I mean, I'm treated in a certain way, and I never get in contact except very briefly with trustees and so forth. And I've heard some nightmarish tales from a few of those, but I can't validly attack the problem. The one thing I'm going to do is the thing that helped me retain my sanity was that I finally got enough stuff to read in there. And one of the things that disturbs me about the mentality of jailers, and I think it's better than it was 10 years ago, but they seem to feel that you're coddling prisoners if you just give them enough to read. It's an incredible attitude. And also little things like you're issued lye soap, which it's not as bad as it sounds because it's not that abrasive, but there's no reason why, no fiscal reason, no budgetary reason that would justify not giving very inexpensive regular bath soap. The reason it's done the other way, I'm convinced, is because they try to really rob you of dignity. There's a certain factor, a certain mentality that says that everybody who's in jail's got to be a bad guy, so to give them some normal bath soap would be coddling them. And that's bullshit, to put it bluntly. And it disturbs me. The point I was going to make is that there's a foundation currently. Its main principals are F. Lee Bailey, who represented me at one point in my case, and musician B.B. King, that is dedicated to providing more and better reading material in jails all over the country. That may be the real extent that I'm going to try to participate, because I think there would be some weakness in my trying to become an instant expert in prison reform. But I'll tell you one thing I'm going to do is that on a paper like the Times, we have a huge staff, a lot of expertise. I mean, guys who are education writers are guys who specialize in covering campuses and school boards, and they aren't running out after fire engines also. There really is a need in the news media for people to specialize in areas such as prison reform, to really become experts so that they can constructively report more than what the officialdom hands out in a press release, and on the other side, merely take the complaints of various groups that are upset. And I think, I don't know whether I've answered your question. I'm disturbed about some of these other aspects also, and to the extent that I can use my influence, I'm going to try to fight to correct them. But I don't have the ideal situation, for instance, such as let's take a George Jackson who lived in the system, wrote a great book. Someone has suggested, you ought to write a book about this. Well, not anything all that humorous and exciting happened to me in that 8x12 cell. I didn't even get to have any good jail stories to come out with. I think the most exciting and humorous thing that happened to me was my problem in getting items in. They're afraid that your friends are going to soak the pages of a book in LSD or something. I don't know. They couldn't bring me books. They could bring me underwear, but they still had that same concern about soaking it in amphetamines or something. So you get a brand new pair of underwear, which is encased in cellophane. It would be a very elaborate plot for my friends to have gone to encasing it after soaking it. So they tear it open and they throw it in this vat of water, and then they soak it out, and they wring it halfway dry, and they splot it down in your hand, so you walk back to your cell, this water running down your elbow. That's the most humorous thing that happened to me while I was there. And so I did keep a journal, and maybe I have enough to write a magazine article. I wish I had enough experience there to write a book that would correct wrongs. And I think that one thing that you don't do always in news business is simply entertain, but frankly, you should be able to both entertain or at least be informative in an interesting enough way to bring about some action. I think many times, for instance, the underground press, many times they do good work, but many times they're writing in such a boring way that it must put even their best friends to sleep. And that also happens at the Times every once in a while, where they somehow feel that the length of story, that somehow quantity has got something to do with quality. You sometimes have 80-inch stories rambling on rather than getting to the point. I mean, the point being, and I think in television, you can say that they are geared totally to entertainment, but be more realistic, in fact, to the extent that you have to grab the listeners, the viewers, and the readers, and in such a way that they are going to take the time, because human nature, and I think television is contributing to a downgrade in the easy way to take it. It's so much easier to watch an hour, the 6 o'clock news, eyewitness news, than it is to take the time to read a newspaper, much less a really thoughtful magazine piece. The question is, how can any of us develop the talents and have the influence? If Joe Benti can't have much influence, and in fact he didn't have much influence on the actual news content of a program, the real question is, how do we bring it about, Joe, during our lifetime? I don't know, but I do know that we ought to continue to fight the battle. Now, he's going to fight it, by the way, at Channel 2 in the future, and if you really want to do something, you can improve the ratings of the 11 o'clock news, when and if he can ever get out of his contract difficulties with ABC.
Do you see your case as part of a larger attack on the radio, press, and TV by the Nixon administration?
I don't, but that is not to say that there isn't a larger attack. I just feel my dilemma would have occurred if you had the most friendly administration in the history of mankind in Washington. Judge Older still would have been unfriendly to me. But that isn't to say that we don't have a very unfortunate situation in the current administration. It is not merely anti-news media. As a result of its anti-news media attitude, it's anti the public's right to know.
We have been told that we have time for one last question.
I have a question. I have one.
Let her rip.
Right here.
Oh.
It goes to Bill, and the question I have in mind is, I was thinking about your case always, and on one hand we see the Bill of Rights and our personal rights. On the other hand, you have information that deals with life of other people. Like, I can even go on the street and not feel safe because of the information you don't reveal. So, how do you feel about this?
Well, if you had an instance, if you could show me that anything I'm withholding would endanger your life, you'd have a valid argument. In my case, I simply won't squeal on a couple of attorneys who handed me transcripts, and I fail to see that this will harm you in any way.
I don't think that was the intent of your question, was it?
Sure, that was. I don't mean myself personally.
Oh, right.
I'll give you an example. A couple months ago, the Manson gang, they killed a sailor and a woman, I think.
That's right.
And
well, I think I see your point. If what I had, in other words, if I knew something about the Manson family and wouldn't reveal it or wouldn't reveal the source of it, and they still were walking around as a result of my not revealing, then I would be wrong. In this instance, however, I revealed the information so the public would in fact know that these people were willing to go out and kill other celebrities. So I did put the information forth really in a way that would at least protect those people. I'm certain that the Burtons, for instance, were glad to read about that, so they'd take some extra precaution. But so that it's not a matter of keeping that information away so that dangerous people are still walking around because I wouldn't tell. I did tell. The only thing I won't do is squeal on the guys who gave me the information. And of course, they are not criminals in the normal sense, although some people argue that since they let me go to jail, that maybe they're not the keenest guys around. But they're probably of no danger to you walking around in the street. They're a little bit of a menace to me.
I burdened my class last week with some readings from Thomas Jefferson, and I think one way to conclude this would be a quote of Jefferson's. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. The functionaries of every government have propensities to command at will the liberty and property of their constituents. There is no safe deposit for these but with the people themselves, nor can they be safe without information. Where the press is free and every man able to read, all is safe.
Let me just make one more comment in regard to, people can say, well, the press makes mistakes and error, and so which on occasion we are. The news media is guilty of inaccuracies and sometimes a terrible loss or unfairness of perspective. But let me ask you in regard to, I've thought about every mistake I have ever known about in the news media, and they've made some errors, but they've never made a mistake that cost the country 65,000 lives and $190 billion, and we are in Vietnam still today because we had, I think, even a well-meaning man, you may not grant it, but I think that Johnson lied to the public, felt he was so much wiser and smarter than the rest of us in the public that we couldn't be informed. Had the press really informed this nation of what was going on 4 and 5 years earlier, the situation would be much different in regard to Vietnam. And I think government has this propensity for tremendous injustice, for just barbaric tendencies under the guise, and sometimes, in fact, the sincere well-meaningness. But in a democracy, one guy doesn't get to make those decisions, although I sometimes wonder if we aren't headed now towards somebody declaring themselves dictator in the next couple of weeks.